Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Mark De Silva this evening in support of the Logos and in conversation with Nicholas Rombes. Just a quick webinar overview for our attendees who are joining us. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open as I will be sharing links to pre-order the Logos, which officially releases on October 25th from Literati throughout the event. The Q&A is available to you. However, you could please feel free to submit questions whenever they come to you using the Q&A. And live transcription is available to you as well using the CC icon on the bottom of your toolbar. If you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to pre-order or purchase books directly below me in the description. And there's also a little typewriter icon in the corner of your screen here. You can click on that and be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events once they become available on our channel. And you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, of course, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. But most of all, we would just like to thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon or much later this evening, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our interlocutor. Mark De Silva is the author of the novel Square Wave and The Logos, as well as the essay collection Points of Attack. He holds degrees in philosophy from Brown and Cambridge. He's a fiction editor of 3 a.m. magazine and a research editor at the New York Times Magazine. Speaking with him this evening, Nicholas Rombes is the author of the novels The Absolution of Roberto Acestes Lang and The Rachel Condition, forthcoming from Clash Books in 2023. His work has appeared in The Believer, the Oxford American, Los Angeles Review of Books, and elsewhere. He's a professor of English at the University of Detroit Mercy. Please join me in welcoming Mark De Silva and Nicholas Rombes into your living rooms.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that, and thank you, Literati, for hosting us. A wonderful bookstore. If you're ever in Ann Arbor on Washington Street, it's such a wonderful place to spend some time in. And it's wonderful to see you, Mark.
You too. This is great. It's sort of a redux of a prior launch, and I'm really happy to be able to chat with you again.
Yeah, for sure. I'm holding, my copy here of the Logos, and I really admire, and I love this book. I've fallen in love with it, and I'll just say a few things about it that maybe can frame some of our dialogue. One of the things that I really like about this book is that it's big, but it's also intimate. And I like the scope of the book, but also the intimacy. And there are so many, I would almost call them like little pathways that the reader can take. They're not digressions exactly, but little pathways that you can get lost in and spend some time in. And I just love the notion of bigness and intimacy at the same time. It's also a novel of ideas. But it's an interesting, and actually some novels of ideas aren't that interesting. This is a propelling read too, which I think that from, just a writer's point of view, I really admire how it's a novel of ideas that's also plotted and that also has characters that the reader can empathize with along the way. So I love the mixture of that, the philosophicalness of it, but also the humanity of it. I love the way you reframe larger ideas into the intimacies of personal life, daily life, kind of phenomenological life, living. So I admire it for all those reasons. And if you're going to read it, I would say, I'm a sucker for endings, and I get fairly emotional at endings. And I was thinking, when I came to the end of this novel, I felt unexpectedly moved by the last, and I'm talking the ending, maybe the last few pages. And it just kind of caught me off guard. And I think that it's a really earned ending in that sense. Like, I was caught off guard because I didn't realize how deeply I was invested in the characters, especially the narrator. With a first person narrator, you're really, you have to hold hands with that person. So the ending kind of got me, and I love that. So thank you for being here. And I know we talked a little bit beforehand about kind of how tonight's going to go, and I'll be asking you to maybe read a few passages that I've picked out that maybe we can riff on. And maybe also just to begin thinking a little bit about indie publishing. So Clash Books, hurrah to Clash Books for bringing this book out into the world. You and I both have oddly similar, even though we have vastly different life backgrounds, oddly similar fiction experiences, in that we both published our first novels through $2 Radio. And in indie,
roughly around the same time as well.
Roughly around the same time, right? 2014 and 16, maybe. And then for our second novels, ended up independently without really talking to each other at Clash Books, another indie publisher, also run by a couple, right? So, you and I have both experience with the granularity of working with an indie publisher. I'm just wondering, what's your experience been like, in working with maybe Clash or, working with an independent publisher, in terms of just bringing the book to life and bringing it out into the world?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for your introduction and your general feedback about the logo. So I'll be excited to talk with you further about that. That's all very interesting. But as far as indie publishing, I mean, there's a kind of openness and directness that's very nice, that you don't get the sense that everything's going to be submitted to a committee, or I need to check with so and so. You're often working with the publisher is also the editor, so there's a very direct sort of framing. I mean, I suppose it's comparable to indie record labels or a certain other forms of even certain kind of micro budgeted films, even where people are sort of, it's all hands on deck, everyone's involved simultaneously. Like just recently with this one, I'm in these deep discussions with the typesetting and with the cover design, whereas my understanding is on a large press, your input on those things is maybe not received quite as deeply or as taken quite as seriously. So I just feel there's a broad openness. I mean, this comes against a background of looking at larger publishers and seeing that at one point I was working with a literary agent, and I no longer do, because we sort of came to an understanding that, hey, to make this worth my while as an agent, I need to be able to sell this for a significant sum. And she's like, look, your books are of a certain type that they're just not pitched at a kind of audience that's we're going to sell 20,000 copies, which is sort of the idea of a mainstream title. So I think there are certain strictures of that larger publishing world that I don't think, I mean, there are a lot of restrictions, and here you feel like the text is it. We're focusing on the work, and that's sort of the be all and end all. So I find it very, very freeing. I mean, I work at the New York Times Magazine, and so I see magazine pieces coming through there, and I see the machinery of an organization like the Times, and only certain things can sort of come through the gates, and it limits sort of the range of things. So in that way, I think I have some appreciation for the narrowing. So I found it very, very free, open, and sort of spontaneous in a way. And yourself, I mean, how did you experience, going from $2 and through on to now to Clash, I guess, for your 2023 release, right?
Oh yeah, no, same, very similar, Mark. And I appreciate what you say about an agent and about the selling part. And often you might hear from an agent or a big publisher, I love the book, it spoke to me. But marketing says, this or that. And it's like, that's kind of sad, it's inauthentic. It's the way the business works, but it feels kind of weird. And I love how our experiences in $2 Radio and Clash, they're going to take a risk, right? I love the book and I want to publish it.
That's right.
And the sales are important, obviously, but that comes later. And, I think it also speaks, Mark, to the idea of passionately getting a book out in the world. And then who knows what's going to happen? I mean, it's once it's out there, it may take on a life of its own. You never know how the jet stream is going to pick something up. And indie presses seem really willing to take that risk, send a balloon up.
That's right. And they can also do one of the key things is that they can do small print runs. They don't have to commit to, a giant number of copies where now there's this problem if we don't unload these. Whereas, you can do a few hundred books at an indie press and see what happens, see how readers respond, and build from there. So it allows for a kind of scaling where you don't have to hit the ground running with 10,000 copies or that sort of thing. So the flexibility, it all depends on the kind of fiction. If you're writing straight down the middle stuff, then I would probably go with a large publisher because you get some more money for it. It would be, it would be a different experience. But if you're writing stuff like you and I write, which is a little bit more, in various respects, challenging, it's going to be. I know some people who have gone through the larger houses for that, and many have a very mixed experience. So I'm all right having a smaller distribution with more control and more, direct input than a larger one where you are, as it were, a component in a larger campaign built around the book. So.
Oh, yeah, for sure. No, I totally agree. And your book is it's so driven by, there's so many ways to frame it. I was thinking it's a commentary. It feels it's a commentary, but it's not an ironic commentary. And I was fascinated. I have way too many questions to ask and way too many passages I wanted you to read. So I picked out a few that maybe spoke to a few of this. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Is the first person narrator unnamed? I didn't want to
unnamed. That's exactly right. And it's sort of a unitary narration for the entire, the length of the book, which is quite, as is quite bulky. So.
Yes. Yeah. No, I love the sustained voice of that. Yeah. I was thinking of a few passages, and I'll just tell you the page and then maybe frame it. So I was thinking of something on, this would be around page 145, Mark.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure I'm pronouncing the magazine. Is it, is it Cosquet?
It's after the cave in France. So it's Cosquer.
Cosquer. Okay,
yeah.
Great. Yep.
Okay.
And I'm thinking, and this is just one of many passages I could have picked that have to do with the idea of, I guess, a question of how to be authentic. And this is what I mean about the book. I think would appeal to so many people, no matter whether you're in the arts or not. It's a question we all face, I think, in this accelerated world of social media, kind of how to be a person in the world, how to be authentic. And in the old days, I would have said this is kind of like a meta novel, because it's sort of so much of what the characters do, they also reflect on the process of what they're doing. But often those meta novels from the 70s and 80s and even 90s there's ironic. And by ironic, I'm using it kind of like there's almost a cynical tone.
Yes.
Here, I feel like the character's self-awareness is almost, by this point in 2022, and when this comes out, built into somehow into our DNA, that the characters are always thinking about their positionality, not only in the art that they create, but in how they present themselves, which I suppose maybe humans have always done. But it's like, since it's reflected back on us so much now, it's become kind of a massive part of our consciousness. And in the Cosquer section on 145, we have the narrator who is looking at the proofs for the magazine. And the paragraphs in particular are two, but I'll let you decide if you think you need a little bit more than that. I'm thinking on the bottom of 145, Mark, the paragraph that begins in the very early days, and then the next paragraph, this is how Cosquer's editorial ethos was forged. That's sort of the paragraph where it hits. So those two paragraphs for sure. But if you think you maybe need to start a little bit earlier or go a little bit longer for the reading, that's great too. I think we have plenty of time.
Where exactly are we at?
Okay, so on 145, making sure we have the same versions too. This would be at the paragraph near the bottom that begins in the very early days, before there were any actual plans for a magazine. I'd had a conceptual influence on Cosquer.
Can you give me 1 second? I'm going to get it down.
Yeah, no, I'm working with the advanced reader's copy, so it may be slightly different. One thing we didn't check before we talked about the passages, but not the page numbers. So Mark's going to check on that. It's a beautiful book. right? Thick. And
Sorry about that.
oh
Okay,
no, that's
good.
fine. Yeah, yeah.
All right. I'll take those two graphs.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, in
That
the
way-
very, and then this is how.
Okay. In the very early days, before there were any actual plans for a magazine, I'd had a conceptual influence on Kosker. Shortly after college, there'd been many discussions among our group about the sort of artistic progress that refused to sever or mask its connection with the hand, that insisted on it in the face of digital technologies. But, and this was crucial to all of us, without stooping to unredeemed irregularities and eccentricities or the one-note trumpeting of illegibility that poisoned the 80s and 90s, whether it was Chantry or Carson or Brody or Glazer. Even more obviously, there could be no truck with nostalgia and empty relativities. This is how Kosker's editorial ethos was forged, a precise, careful grounding in the analog that avoided every ideological pitfall we could think of. So on the one hand, the magazine had no website. On the other, its appearance could not have less resembled a DIY production, given just how crisply it was constructed in both the what and the how of it. That's why we could give prominence to certain kinds of painting and drawing over photography without any spurious anti-technological stance. What did it mean, after all, to be against technology per se? A life without fire, and not just metaphorically, a life without wheels, a life indeed without language, one of our earliest technologies? No, the question was rather which technologies you picked and how exactly you chose to deploy them. That was still true. What did you choose to burn?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And of course, Mark, we know each other a little bit, and the whole analog digital divide is fascinating me, right? I could go down so many rabbit holes with this.
Yeah.
But for the purposes and in the place of this narrative, I was thinking about what you say on what your narrator says, right? So we have narratology, right? You have Mark
Yes.
De Silva,
Yeah.
first person narrator, which I guess we could also talk forever about.
Yes.
About that persona, right?
Yes.
But we won't. We just wanted to ask you for a moment so we don't get too far off track. Even more obviously, there would be no truck with nostalgia or empty relativities. And so I'm thinking here, large scale, I'm thinking of the nostalgia in our moment right now for the analog, right? For vinyl,
Yes.
cassette tapes,
Mm-hmm.
films that are Ty West's new film, Pearl, is shot on, Technicolor.
Yes.
The ways in which the analog nostalgia is burnt into even digital filters, and handwriting is kind of coming back. Like there's a big thing in like fountain pens now. But what I'm fascinated with here is that these artists are interested in going back, but not to do it with nostalgia, and to do it do it with analog that avoided any ideological pitfall we could think of. So on the one hand,
that sort of the raggedness, right? That which is typical. The DIY is how so much of analog nostalgia works. The imperfection is the value that say cassette tapes you mentioned in particular. I grew up with cassette tapes and they were pretty bad, really. They really don't preserve sound that well. They stretch and bend. And yes, there's something at a certain stage in life you find kind of interesting about those distortions. True. But then there's another way of thinking about the analog, which is one can still aspire to very rigid and high level standards of perfection by hand. I mean, even just think of all the work that predated the Industrial Revolution, right? Or all of the painting that is very meticulous. So I think analog doesn't have to mean scratchy or ragged or something homegrown. It can be tight. It can be its own rigor it can bring with it. And so that's sort of the idea there, that we don't want to just try to retreat into the past and try to turn our backs on everything that's come, because not all of it is bad. I mean, just like with all the other technologies, there are many things that are worth salvaging, many things you can build on, and it's not particularly productive to simply look backward and hope that the past can save you, because the past wasn't that good either. I mean, that's the problem.
Right. So do you find these, yeah, it's really interesting. Do you find So is there a way, are these characters sort of trying to go, in this sense, no website, going back to analog, very handcrafted, but without nostalgia? So is there a way, I mean, is there, I guess maybe with indie publishing, in a sense, we're doing it, we're going back to very handcrafted, but is there a way to go backwards without it having to be because it's some golden age, but because actually there's a usefulness?
That's right. Like, I mean, what one gets, for instance, in just the difference between a painting and a photograph, right? That's another topic that comes up early in the book. There's a flatness, there's a poverty to photographs in many respects, that things that they lose that only the hand can manage to incorporate. And in the same way that the human eye does not work in the same way, the way we process the retinal image is not like the photograph. So therefore, it has a depth of focus that no photograph has, right? There's an emptiness. There's in other words, there's a flaw to the apparently cleaned up or perfected image that the hand can recover. What analog, these other things can recover actually a more perfect rendering. And it's not that it's scratchy, it's actually more perfect. It captures more of reality, and it takes us away from a certain flatness, as it were. So I just think it's part and parcel of seeing a lot of the things we see as cleaned up, better than before, are actually missing a lot. They're missing a whole lot. And the photograph is a perfect example. They look nothing like visual experience because they have the camera eye just doesn't operate the way the phenomenology of consciousness does, the way we can keep so many things in focus simultaneously. The way experience operates is different, but we tend to naturally capitulate in the face of the digital. It's perfect, it's how it is, but obviously it actually leaves a lot to be desired, I would say. And in particular, it leaves a lot to be desired about expressing the subjectivity of experience,
Well, yeah, and I'm thinking, also who drives the narratives of perfection, who's saying, those don't come from anywhere, they come from capital,
exactly.
Right? So the narrative surrounding them, like better, pristine, closer to reality. And it reminds me, Mark, so much when you're talking about how in Hollywood classical cinema, the notion of what is a realist film. And we start thinking about, well, the Hollywood kind of continuity shots, reverse shot editing, flashbacks, all of the, to create like a realistic film, whatever it might be, a drama that's realistic, has no genre effects, no science fiction, that's like a human drama, is the most unrealistic editing in the world, right? So actually you could argue that a realist film is the most artificial attempt at reconstructing, reality. So I was also interested, though, and just to come back, and I don't want to let you off the hook with this passage. Okay, so these characters also seem really aware. So they may be going back to the analog for practical purposes, artistic purposes, but they also seem very aware of how this is all positioned culturally. And this is where I'm wondering about the meta-ness of these characters, or their inability to separate what they want to do with the way that they perceive their art will be received. And I'm not saying that, I don't know if that's a new thing or not. I mean, reputation and history, but specifically here, even more obviously, there would be no truck with nostalgia and empty relativities. And they're framing it in such a way that they're protecting themselves from any accusations that might come that you're nostalgic or that you're referring. So it's not just that they want to use these handmade technologies to make art. They're positioning themselves in a way that tries to escape the narratives that they think might be told about them. And it seems like they're weighted down with so much worry about performativity. Not just the art, but the acceptance of the art. And I'm wondering,
I think that's what makes them fine artists rather than graphic designers, full stop. They still have the ethos of a fine artist, that, hey, we're not merchandisers, we're not here to move your products more quickly or cleverly. We're actually mobilizing graphic design for the highest possible artistic purposes. In the same way that, so we still have the ambitions of the Renaissance. In that era, you would be the common language of society was Christianity, right? In the West, right? Churches, temples, these paintings were not randomly created out of to express an inner subjectivity. They were part of a shared communal life, and those were the things that needed consecration or expression via the channels of the sculptor or the architect or
Mm.
the painter. So I think similarly, they're looking at graphic design as not merely a hey, this is to move some merchandise. This is for them what painting was for Raphael or something. It is its own way to embody, to capture, in that sense, the logos of the 21st century, which is not churches and those types of things. It is consumer goods, it's products, it's celebrity personalities, it's these other things. And so there's an attempt at, as it were, the kind of consecration of what the world that we have, delusions and all, superficiality and all, but saying that, hey, there's a grand purpose in that, because if that's the essence of what we are, there's something in being able to, encapsulate it and express it via actual public art in that sort of tradition of, or even Greek vases, etc. Those were things that circulated, that had public meanings inscribed on them. So I think maybe they're fine artists, but they think the only serious art is taking place this way, or that's the attempt anyways, that gallery art is actually the decorative art. That's, if you know what I mean. And decorative art is the real art, because that's expressing, as it were, the logos, the semiotics that makes the actual world turn, rather than a hermetic world. I think that's the attempt. The whole book is an exploration of that attempt.
Yes.
Right.
Well,
it's not a celebration of a victory. It is an exploration of how do we get out of some of the ruts that we have faced, in previous attempts to try to get our heads around the kind of lives we live now, as artists, right? So, and this is to say, let's maybe take a turn via capital as opposed to fighting capital in a direct way. How can we reroute those forces in such a way that we can embody and maybe simultaneously critique, but it's like one and the same. It's not from the outside, as it were.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's so good. And I'm so glad to hear you use the word the logos of the 20. Like that's such a great distillation of the title. Yeah. And
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that brings to mind two passages, and I'm one of them is the public art space. There's this great passage about how New York City has decided to clean up its public spaces by privatizing it, and everything is commercialized. I want to get to that maybe, but I also want to get to this other notion of sticking on nostalgia for a moment. The narrator really describes a moment, and this is going to be, I'll tell you where it is and then frame it. This is on page 50. I don't think we talked about this beforehand, Mark. So this one I'm springing on you. I like
that.
All right, you don't know, right? This is the information.
Where are you taking us?
Right, where are we going here with this? This is the whole, the way that the Joy Division. Okay, so, and I thought this was so universal. And as I read a novel like this, I'm filtering it through my own experiences, but also so many of the experiences of people I know. And I think that one of the really interesting things about your book is it's got universal things going on: art, commerce, capital, those relationships, but also really intimate details that many people can relate to by substituting their own experience. Yeah. And for me, the Joy Division section, where how someone fell out of love. I mean, we have all done this. Well, anyone who's over 18, maybe, you fall out of love with what you fell in love with culturally. And then at some point in time, you might refall in love with it, hopefully not out of sheer nostalgia, but maybe out of a rediscovery. And I thought that the language in the paragraph on the bottom of 50 about the band Joy Division, who the narrator is working for the album cover art for, and has a tormented relationship with Joy Division. And I'm wondering if you could just maybe read, if you're okay with it, but you can extend if you want that.
Absolutely. I think that's perfect.
Okay. Okay.
Joy Division was a group I had once found so full artistically in high school, and that's why the band's commission was one of the few I felt truly pleased to have sent my way. I almost didn't require the excuses of poverty and grief to take it on, and to reacquaint myself over the past week with all of the albums and new orders as well. The short-lived singer's vocals, which had the tenor of an even more depressed Jim Morrison, and the epic repetition involved in the band's best songs, seemed, with the brutish palette that washed away so much nuance, to abide grizzled platonic forms. By 19 or 20, of course, I had spurned not only this music, but all of the lesser variants of it, or in truth, simply forgotten about it. Its gravitational pull had waned, not because of the band had changed, but because of the tiny gap that sat at the very center of rock and roll, which you noticed from the beginning when you were totally in its thrall. In that early moment, the abnegation it signaled was in fact the basis for attraction. Over time, though, even from month to month, the void expanded and indeed seemed to empty the music from the inside out. There was something exhaustible about rock, I felt, and those years between 16 and 25 effectively transformed it into a nullity. That was its final state, its telos, its logos too, this massless thing, so that even when performed live, the music in my ears tended towards the Xeroxed tinny quality of an MP3. At this rate, I thought, by 40, the music would vanish altogether for me. I wouldn't hear a thing.
Yeah. And I could have you read forever from this passage. It's just so nice. And I notice, I don't know if we're seeing the Q&A chats, but if anyone, just so we know, maybe we didn't say this, but I think maybe John said it. If you have any questions for Mark or whatever, feel free to put them in the Q&A, because what we'll do at about 7:40, 7:45 is just see if there's any questions, and then John will read them. So it's always really fun and nice when people chime in, and like, especially people you have no idea, it's completely random. So I encourage you, there's no dumb question, right? And some of you may not even have read the novel and you're just hearing about it for the first time. It may be an idea that popped up is something you want to ask. You don't need to have read the novel. Am I right in that, Mark? We're
Completely, yeah.
I just want to, so the line that got me here was the line, I had spurned not only this music, but all the lesser variants of it. Its gravitational pull had waned, not because the band had changed, but because of the tiny gap that sat at the very center of rock and roll. And that, for me, really expressed the beginning of the separation that we feel. And you talk about how it grows into a void.
Yeah.
If Mark were to have continued reading this, we see that how the narrator sort of comes back to Joy Division, discovering it for a second way. But my specific question was, is this gap something that exists particularly in rock and roll? Because you single that out, like it's not like in all music, classical music, jazz.
Yes.
What about that?
I think, see, this is the cleavage between the author and narrator. I personally I'm very profoundly involved with Joy Division. So my own views don't track, but I think the idea is for the narrator and his particular reckoning with mass cultural products, which rock and roll obviously is one of those phenomena, right? Of a new post-war culture with teenagers with spending cash and free time, and it was a phenomenon of the masses in that way, and it was a package that way rather quickly after really from Elvis onward in terms of a commercial force. I think maybe the narrator is locating it in the music, that there is something predetermined or market-centered about rock and roll, designed for a certain consumption, as opposed to maybe some of its sources in bluegrass, rockabilly, etc. But the way it ultimately gets reduced in a way to a kind of grammar that is digestible by broad groups. So I think he finds it in a way disappearing for him, that its mass is consumed, and I think that's part of his struggle to understand. Now, one could also think that the issue is not with rock and roll. One could say it's something about our attentions generally, that in general the gap maybe in his love for it, and that it's the expansion of his disinterest. That he's grown bored, and that might be an attentional lagging. But I think in the context of the narrator, right, his thinking is there's something pre-designed in rock and roll, prefabricated in its designs, and even when it's gratifying, it somehow has commerce at the back of it. And I think even just in its grammar and its logic, that it's meant to be transposable and saleable, and it's not 12 tone, right? It's not Schoenberg. It's not this, hey, you've just got to dedicate yourself, and you're not going to feel you're going to understand it cerebrally or something. It's meant to get you going in a certain way. I think he's fearful of that in a certain way, or anyway, that went away for him. Now, when he re-encounters it, he's maybe thinking he's coming at it in a slightly different way and saying, well, what was there? What did I ignore because of my disgust with commerce or disgust with materialism? I mean, part of the narrator's turn is from fine art towards these commercial arts. So in turn, and that what it means in terms of Joy Division is his original thing was to push away from that towards more fine art kind of ideas, which is typical, but he's returning to it and saying, maybe there's a gravitas that I've missed in the simple critique of these mass cultural phenomena, that they can carry their own weight if, maybe separated from some of the marketing that we're bombarded to in our sort of youth, to be conditioned to like, as opposed to like free from that kind of bondage.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm resonating with, Johnny Rotten's last comment at the Winterland,
Yes.
I can't remember now. It's lost my, but, you've all been scammed, at the very end, and he drops the mic and leaves. And it's about the Sex Pistols, but it's also about, have we been all ripped off? Like, have we fallen in love with something that's been a highly controlled marketing? Like, have we invested our teenage angst in a ripoff, in some way? And I love that. And I also love what you say about, circling back to what we talked about earlier about the first, you were saying that here's where you don't track with the narrator.
Yes.
And that's a fascinating process, when we're writing in first person, that of course so many people assume, oh, Mark doesn't like, Joy. What's his beef with Joy Division,
Yeah.
So that tracking process, are you finding a part of for instance, in the Joy Division section, are you finding a part of yourself, a sliver of yourself that feels this way and exploiting it? Like, what if I went down this path? Or are you completely reimagining some other?
I think it's the degree to which you can separate from yourself in writing, right? You're going to have to start with the materials that are to hand, whatever type of writer you are, even if you're writing, absolute fantasy, if you're doing Tolkien, you still have to start with whatever is to hand, whatever is in your experience. But to what degree can you separate from your actual lived experience and take a seed that is real and expand towards an imagined sort of horizon? So that would be an example where the fact that it's even in the book, it speaks to my interest in it, right? But then that's the interest in, even why I wanted to undertake this in the first person. To what extent can you sort of almost have an out-of-body experience? Can you separate from your own consciousness and dream up another mind that obviously is bound to have traces in your mind? But the question is not, does it have any traces or not? It's always going to. But the question is, to what extent can you lift off from there? And there are plenty of writers who I feel like they don't have very much capacity for that. It's more or less them is what's going in the book, in a first person kind of book. But here I did try to explore things that are, I also didn't want to make it just absolutely distinct in such a way as if I'm refusing any personal connection with the material. I wanted to venture into that difficult area and then keep my distance, as it were, and be able to explore that. So that was my experience of writing in the first person, which I hadn't done up to this. This book is, the English edition is 1,000 pages, and it's 1,000 pages in the first person, one continuous sort of narration. But it was very important for it not to be me, for it to be, go somewhere in your mind and to extend beyond what is merely within your ken to a kind of imagined circle. So
well, I think you can tell too, and I don't want to have this turn into a dumping session on autofiction.
Right.
We can do autofiction, but I think, and I don't know if you're referring to certain books that can't do it, but autofiction is, all the was or is all the rage, and I find in my own experience that you can tell when, I'm not going to call it an artistic separation, because some people can do that, but I feel in the first person, like you're doing it, the tension between the first person persona and the author, there's some trace or mark or stain that lets the reader feel the art of it, right? Of that, and I which makes it different than like a stream of conscious first person that's auto fiction that's basically tracks with the author's life. And I was wondering, as a writer, how do you know, like when I'm writing, how do you know if it's working? And I guess this is sort of pulling out from that, but you talked about writing an entire book, in the first person.
Yeah.
Every author would have a different, answer. Mine is often, I feel like I want to go back and fall into that world and spend time in that voice that I've created. When I don't want to go back and fall into that world, I feel like, well, if I don't want to, maybe my reader won't, and something's not working.
Yes.
How do you know? Because it takes a lot of guts. I mean, I'm just going to say kudos, because it takes a lot of guts to do a big novel in this era of short, to stick with it. How do you know when you're not failing?
Right. I think when I would go back and look, I mean, part of it was, if you stick too closely to who you are, that the fabric of the book actually starts to disintegrate, because it's sort of, it becomes kind of clunky around your own personal details, sort of intruding into the material. So I think after a few hundred pages where you have a sense for a character, there is a sense of an integrity to a character that at a certain point, once you set him or her in motion, if now you pull from your biography and try to slot that in later, you're too close with your eye, as it were, and it's you really, it shows. I mean, I just would read through it and be like, oh, that's a weird kink in the character. Now it's suddenly me again, like you have to let it flow away from you, and drift. Well, there's always the tether to bits of, and recombine bits of your own experience. You can, I would say it's a pretty intuitive, like, when, oh, that's just a jammed in fact about me, or that's a point I really like to make in cocktail parties, so I'll put that in here. You know what I mean? Like, that's just you. You're not dreaming anymore. You're just talking now. And that's a different type of book. And if one wants to write a memoir, that's perfectly legitimate project. There are some amazing memoirs, but if you're not doing that, then it's a little bit, when you disrupt the dream of the character, it's a little bit like, what are we doing here? What's the point? Why don't you just write an essay or a memoir, if that's what you really just want to talk about yourself? If you want to get outside of yourself, that seemed to me the project of this book was not to write a 1,000-page memoir, but to write a 1,000-page extension of the self, as it were. And the length of the book is a kind of distance you travel away from yourself, and that's for me the magic of fiction. And the part of its cognitive value is that it's not a recapitulation of the real. It's a push toward an imagined domain, which might refract the real in a new way for you, perhaps, or become its own kind of psychic territory where you can exist sort of intellectually and emotionally, and creates a kind of island in a way too. So those are my
it can become real, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It can become real. Yeah.
Especially with a long book. I mean, you spend literally weeks living in this place, right? So that was another one of my purposes, I think, in making the book this way, is that it's meant to be a place you can sort of live a little bit. In other words, the shorter works are ones that are meant to be, you hear people say, I read it in one sitting. I definitely didn't want you to read this in one sitting. You know what I mean? I wanted it to be intermingled with your experience, your ordinary experience of life, and to become a kind of shadow life. And I think when I read long books of the same sort, I often think of those months reading that as, oh, those were really distinct months, because they were like taking little trips to this other world for those, say, 2 months of reading The Tunnel, say, by William Gass, or whatever other long work you engage in. So that's so good. And I noticed there are a few, I think, if I'm reading it right, and John, I'll let you hop in. If there are a few questions, do you want to take it? If not, Mark and I can keep talking.
Absolutely. There are a couple questions, some questions, and people can still feel free to submit their questions in the Q&A if they have any. But we have a question from Haley, who asks, comparing the past to the present, what would be your stance on the constant concern of planned obsolescence, and how could that connect to the logos?
Right. I mean, that's obviously part of, if you mean product design, right? So many of the things that we hold in our pockets, for instance, are, famously, suddenly your iPhone, after it's a generation or two old, it loses all battery life and cannot be apparently function in even the most minimal way. So clearly, I mean, Apple actually was called out on that they had adjusted things such that you're going to want to upgrade, what you have. And these things are now for the trash heap that's sort of, encompassing the earth with this. So I think a lot of the features of what we have now are even pop culture, to return to rock and roll music. Some of these things are almost designed to be earworms for a season, but we'll go for the cheap hook rather than something that might engage you in a more complex relationship that doesn't fizzle as fast. So actually, that's quite interesting. I think certain types of music and cultural artifacts have that issue, and that's part and parcel of the era that we live in. And that's part of the marketing, that, in the old days, product differentiation, it was called, where you've got to find something in this, a new color of paint that we have to offer, like go back to an iPhone. We've got it in rose gold now. Very different phone. You're going to need, the idea of making a modification that makes no real change, but will create another sale and also a waste product as well. So I do feel that's clearly a part of that. I don't know the artistic way to treat that sort of thing. I can't say, but certainly that's I can only see it as part of the way we live on multiple valences. And you, Nick, what do you make?
Yeah. No, I think that and I think that I was just thinking as you were talking, Mark, that the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction is, I think, a force against that in some way, because I think a book can be the ultimate non-planned obsolescence thing, that it can exist, as we were talking about. So I think that the work that you create in a novel is a force. It's already a form of critique. A novel like this, I think, whether critique is in the content or not, it itself existing is a form of critique. So I agree. John, other questions?
A question from Lauren, who asks, could you see this book as a film, or does it only work as a novel?
I mean, if I think of it scene by scene and what's on the page, I suppose it could work as a film. That'd be very interesting, because film is one of the main subject matters of the book, right? And in the book, I have even created sort of micro descriptions of fictional films by real filmmakers. And I think Nick is
my favorite parts.
Yeah. Go ahead. I know from your own work, this certainly is an interest of yours.
Well, I love that. And I think that, for me, so I'm at quick side note on that. I found myself interacting with the book in the sense of I knew some of the films were real. Some of them I felt really real because you pulled it off so damn well, Mark, and I was like, damn, that's got to exist. But so here's my naivety, but how this your book has sunken into my head and into my family. So as I'm reading, I'm from Northwest Ohio. Okay. So I don't know, I don't know a lot. PS1. All right. I'm reading this PS1 thing and I'm like, okay, MoMA, PS1. All I think is like, well, public high school #1. Right. And that's all. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, as I'm puzzling over this, my daughter calls and she's in Brooklyn and we're talking, and she says, out of the blue, 10 minutes after I'd been reading, guess what I'm doing tonight, Dad? I said, what? She said, I'm going to PS1. I said, funny that you would say that. What is PS1? I said, I looked it up on Wikipedia and it doesn't define PS1. And she's like, well, it's the MoMA thing. And I was like, so it really exists? Or is it PS1? But for a while, I carried your PS1 in my head as a fake.
Yeah,
I thought you made it. I said, what a clever thing to name it high school.
Yes.
But anyway, this goes back to the films that you made. And I think that it's a testament to your art that you created seamless bounds in the book between what is my sense of the real and the fiction. So
and I think because of that, there is absolutely a cinematic and theatrical, a dramatic element to the structuring of the book. So I would say I can imagine a film. I don't know if it would be a good film, but I can imagine one. Yes.
Here's a question. What advice do you have for future authors to ensure that their characterization of narrator doesn't cross the fine line of accidental implicit bias or projection.
That's interesting. I mean, I guess it depends what your goals in narration are. Some authors would lean into their biases, as it were. I mean, what makes us interesting and distinctive is it to some extent our subjective preferences, the things that aren't objective about us and our biases. But at the same time, if he's speaking more towards maybe what we were talking about earlier about where you end up inside of you're trying to develop a character, you're sort of laying this out over dozens and dozens of pages, but you end up starting to intrude. I mean, I think the best thing from my experience is simply rereading and being honest with yourself. Like, to what extent, or as I put it, are you making points that you like to make at a bar or at a cocktail? Like, if it sounds too much like you, then you got to wonder, is this really whoever I've set in motion? Does it have unity or coherence with that? Or am I now sort of putting my finger on the scale because I had something to say? And that's also a problem for the novel of ideas generally, right? Too many, the ones that go wrong are the ones where you sense, wait a minute, this took a sudden swerve so you could get in a public service announcement or some kind of message you wanted. So I would say rereading is the only thing, and a certain kind of honesty about where you're putting your finger on the scale.
And I would also say, Mark, from a reader's point of view, the feeling of how close are we supposed to be with this narrator, the first person narrator. In other words, is the book kind of asking us to endorse on some level the worldview that's being presented? Because with the first person narrator, we're always asked to do a deep dive into empathy, where we are literally walking through the eyes of the first person narrator. And at some point, I think for your book, one of the great tensions I felt in it was, how am I supposed, does the worldview of the book want me to be close with the narrator and be critiquing and commenting and like nodding like exactly? Or do we want to see him as foolish, or presumptuous, or so when does that distance happen? And I love the modulation from the reader's point of view, which I think gets to the question a little bit also about biases, right? Because an interesting first person narrator is going to be strongly biased, have strong opinions, because they're not just one-dimensional likable. They can be really unlikable characters, or they could be 80% likable but 20% unlikable. So I think that's just that for me, you pull it off really nicely in the texture of your novel.
And I feel it's a little bit like you say about the films and other elements where I'm trying to be seamless between what may be something you want to grab at as real or endorsable or something you can run with, and where you suddenly have to pull back and say, wait, have I gone too far here? Or is that really right? Does that follow from that? Because the narrator is quite persuasive in suggesting that these things follow. So I guess one of the goals of the book is to keep that constant question in mind, like, where are your alliances? Because there are parts of it that you're going to want to be like, that sounds about right to me. But then there are other parts which I hope are seamless with that, where you suddenly find yourself saying, why am I agreeing with this? You know what I mean? Like, do I agree with such a thing? That sort of thing. So yeah.
For sure.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, Nick, if you wanted to take the honors of asking perhaps one final question to close us out.
Sure. Yeah. I'm wondering, getting down to the nitty gritty of the book out in the world, and what we're doing today, is talking about the book, and it's a part of the process of publishing. And I'm wondering, especially because I think there are some people in the audience who are interested in the writing and the publication part. How do you feel about the whole, I'm not going to call this publicity in a way, because we're friends, and
I know what you mean though.
How do you feel about it? Like, it's a book about art and commodity.
Yes. No, absolutely. There's a whole packaging, and I get notes from my publisher when they're speaking with a distributor, and the distributor really likes the flap copy, or the distributor finds this puzzling. Do you think you could rejigger this? And I found the whole thing kind of interesting, that whatever it is you're creating, other people have their own designs, and it fits into their life in different ways. And in some sense, that's not altogether different from the way that when you write a book, you write it, thinking about the way you're reacting to it as you read and redraft and read, but it takes on a life in somebody else's life, So the first time it takes on a life in somebody else's life is in the publishers, right? And in the marketers and the design people who say, I see it this way, or they send you a draft book cover. I read it and this is what came to mind. And you're like, really? Or, but then you're like, well, maybe there's something to that. Like I remember that we were looking at certain colors for the cover, and I think I originally wasn't pleased with purple. I was like, I don't see it that way. I think I wanted to shade more towards blue or something. A few weeks went by and I was like, no, I think I'm starting to see this better this way. So even things that you think of as tangential, or they're saying it's fun, it's engaging color, it'll give it some differentiation on shelves, right? That's the marketing talk. But I found on a sort of a more artistic and aesthetic level, it felt to me to galvanize the themes in a certain way and the color palette of it. So I don't know, I'm okay with it so long as I can. It's a little bit like Joy Division, recuperating Joy Division. After you have the revulsion and rejection on a commercial level, you can still come back and say, but it is actually intrinsically good, just like some popular things are actually good. The Beatles aren't bad because they're popular, right? They're still good and they're super popular. So sometimes you can learn a thing or two from people who might have different motives in mind. That's a theme of the book too, I think, right?
Right.
The businessman has his own motives, the artist has his, and how they interweave is the whole story, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour on At Home with Literati. Mark De Silva, Nicholas Rombes, thank you so much for joining us this evening to talk about the logo. So you can, of course, pre-order it. There's a link in the chat from Literati Bookstore. There will also be links directly below me in the description if you're watching on YouTube. We hope we can have you both in the store once your publishing paths coincide once again in the not too distant future. But until then, we hope that you stay well. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us this evening or this afternoon. Thank you for your questions. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Take care, everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great, Nick.